It is restrained by the gentle pressure of the girdle from any downward motion, while other forces from the altar rush in through the apparel which is facing them, and one more bearing with them something of the priest's personality, pour out upon the congregation through the opposite apparel, diagram 16. The amice. This vestment, plate 19, commonly appears as a rectangular piece of linen, either plain or shaped to fit the shoulders, with strings from its upper corners which cross over the breast and are tied round the body of the wearer, so that it rests on the neck and shoulders. It seems originally to have been intended to cover the head also, and as a relic of this use, the Roman priest still rests it for a moment on his head before placing it round his neck. It may have been in the early centuries a mere protection for the throat, or possibly intended to prevent drops of perspiration from flowing onto the chasuble. In the Middle Ages, the upper edge, which turned over the neckband of the chasuble, was adorned with a rich apparel and sometimes heavily jeweled. This apparel is now disallowed by the Roman Church, though from the inner point of view it is the most valuable part of the vestment. Our students must be careful not to confuse the amice with the almus, which is a quite different ecclesiastical garment, even though the latter is sometimes corrupted into amis or ames. The derivations of the words lie along lines wide apart from each other, though the modern forms are much alike. In the liberal Catholic Church, we retain the amice in its medieval form, with a gold-embroidered apparel along its upper edge, as does the ritualistic party in the Church of England. The apparel may be of the color of the day, but it has been found that an apparel of either white or rich red silk or satin, covered with gold lace, serves well for any season, and harmonizes with all the colors except the rose. Some of us have even discarded the rectangular piece of linen altogether, and invented what is practically a new kind of amice, consisting of the apparel only, stiffened with buckram or thin cardboard, and fastened round the neck like a collar, slightly shaped to fit the shoulders. Possibly this would not be acknowledged by our Roman brothers to be an amice at all, but from the inner point of view it does its work admirably. For the purposes of the celebration of the Holy Eucharist, it is desirable to stop up the neck hole of the alb with something in addition to the stole that will serve as an excellent conductor of the mighty force which rushes up the arms of the priest. The gold lace collar of the amice meets the demand admirably, and conducts the power to the oprez of the chasuble, where it joins the great current already flowing there. The girdle. The girdle, plate 22, is the rope which confines the alb at the waist. It is often called the cincture, but it seems to be that that name is more appropriately applied to the broad band which encircles the cassock, plate 20. This girdle for the alb was, however, at one time also broad and flat, made of silk or cloth of gold, and profusely adorned with jewels. Now it is usually a closely woven rope of white linen, with a large tassel of the same material at each end, but it may be of silk or gold cord, the latter perhaps best. Some priests have girdles of the 4 liturgical colors to harmonize with the rest of the vestments, but this is immaterial. The work of the girdle is to press the alb close to the cassock at the waist, and to hold in place the crossed ends of the stole of the priest when he celebrates. The chasuble. This, plate 23, is the special sacrificial vestment, the most important and highly treasured of them all. The richest materials, the most abundant decoration, the choicest jewel work, the most elaborate embroidery, have through the ages of church history been lavished upon this, which may well be called the court dress of the priest, as it is reserved exclusively for his appearance in the very presence of Christ, the heavenly King. It has been thought to represent the seamless robe of Christ, and to typify love, which enfolds and holds together all the other virtues, and safeguards and illumines their beauty with its protection. It was probably originally derived from a garment not unlike the Mexican poncho, a great circle of cloth with a hole cut in the center of it through which the head was thrust. Hence early chasuples were bell-shaped, and some have been described as resembling copes with their front edges sewn together. But this shape, however, efficient for retaining force, was soon found to be intolerably inconvenient in practice, and the chasuble became an oval vestment, shortened at the sides until it reached the wrists, and eventually only a little below the elbows of the wearer. This was evolved the Gothic chasuble, by far the most graceful and effective form of the vestment, which persisted all through the Middle Ages. The Church of England, where it is wise enough to use Eucharistic vestments, retains this shape, as does our liberal Catholic Church. But since the Reformation, the Roman Church, pursuing convenience at the cost of efficiency, has still further abbreviated the chasuble and adopted the unaesthetic fiddleback shape. In this, the sides of the garment are entirely cut away, and the strips passing over the shoulders are little more than a pair of braces to hold back front together. Also, a large slit is usually left for the head instead of the small round neck hole. In this change, the original and most suitable arrangement of the hauptfraise has also necessarily been abandoned, and its place is usually taken by a long straight column of gold embroidery down the front and a large Latin cross on the back. These are often most beautifully worked, and they are cleverly interpreted to mean the pillar to which, according to the Gospel story, Christ was bound, and the cross, which he is said to have borne up the hill of Calvary, but they are distinctively less useful for the flow of the spiritual force than the older plan of the Y cross, which has a column both at the neck and the front, with the arms of the cross sloping upwards in each case so as to meet over the shoulders, giving the shape of the Greek letter psi, plate 23, or of a Latin cross with oblique arms. When the bands are so disposed, the pillar on the front is called the pectoral, the pillar on the back the dorsal, and the auxiliary bands which pass over the shoulders the humeral orphreys. The Roman Church does, however, retain the Gothic chasuble in some places, and it is said that there is an increasing tendency to revert to its use. The chasuble, which laid out flat upon a table, makes a close approximation to the well-known ecclesiastical figure called the vesica piscis, a pointed oval drawn upon two equal circles, the circumference of each of which passes through the center of the other. Looked at from either or behind, the vestment has much the appearance of an escutcheon. Besides the hauptfraise already mentioned, a narrow band of gold runs through the edge of the entire vestment, and also round the neck hole, and in the center of the back, at the point where the arms of the Y leave the middle line, there is a circle of gold embroidery, usually a symbol of some sort, a host and chalice, a dove, a pelican, or the letters IHS, surrounded by a halo of rays, which forms the physical basis for a vortex of tremendous power. Any of the materials described as suitable for a set of vestments is appropriate for a chasuble, but it will be found convenient that it shall be fairly pliant, as stiff and heavy folds are much in the way of the arms at the time of the elevation, and are apt to present an ungraceful appearance. The hauptfraise should be of gold braid or cloth of gold when possible. Sometimes they are made of gold-embroidered silk of a color differing from that of the vestment, but when that is the case they should be edged with gold braid, that no obstacle may be placed in the way of the outflow of energy. During the whole time that the consecrated elements are on the altar, they are radiating force at various levels of consciousness with unimaginable intensity. The angel of the presence deals with this while he is with us, but the priest has to take entire charge after his departure, and it is to help him in this tremendous work that the machinery of the chasuble has been designed. Whichever pillar of the vestment happens to be turned towards the host or chalice captures, concentrates and directs the power, while through the opposite pillar, and especially through the central vortex at the back when the priest is facing the altar, the flood pours forth upon the people. Diagram 17. The pillar turned towards the altar acts as a kind of shield or lightning conductor, for the forces of such power that the priest might well be entirely overcome by it and unable to continue his work. Whenever the priest touches either of the sacred elements, the vibrations rush through his arms, and, as has been explained, are caught by the amice and stole and conveyed through them into the central vortex, which glows like a sun. At the moment of consecration, an indescribably glorious line of living fire flashes thus through the arms of the priest, becoming straight from the second person of the Blessed Trinity through the intuitional principle of our Lord. From Christ the God through Christ the Son of Man, these stupendous forces sweep with them those generated by the priest himself and veritably boil inside the chasuble as in a cauldron, and the induction currents set up outside are proportionately vigorous. When the necessary commixtures and transmutations are completed, the combined forces join through the amice, rush round the narrow gold edging of the chasuble, and downward and outward by the pillar which is towards the people. A certain amount overflows all the while under the edges of the vestment, curving up round it like flames, but most of this also is caught and whirled toward the torrent issuing from the vortex. The priests to some extent control the direction of the power, though this is chiefly done by the directing angel who notes the intention of the celebrant. The length of the chasuble must necessarily vary with the height of the celebrant, though no absolute rule can be laid down. Rome recommends that the length behind should be 46 inches, which agrees with that of St. Thomas of Canterbury, preserved at Sons Cathedral. We must, however, remember that vestment is of the old extinguisher shape, and that the modern Roman fiddleback is very broad at the bottom, so that the escutcheon form would need to be somewhat longer. Mr. R.A.S. McAllister, in his work on ecclesiastical vestments, page 86, states, "The dimensions of appointed chasubles circa 14th century at Aix-la-Chapelle, which has been accepted as a standard for modern imitation, are given as follows. Depth of shoulder measuring from neck 33 inches. Length of side from shoulder to point 59 inches. Depth from neck to point in front 54 inches. Depth from neck to point behind 58 inches. Mr. McAllister does not explain by whom this standard has been accepted, and the measurements seem to me to be somewhat excessive. Something between this and the Roman size would be more practical. The large Latin cross on the back of the chasuble, generally used by the Roman Church, is often very beautiful, but somewhat less practical from the inner point of view than the Y-shaped orphre. The force rushing round it is much compressed at the right angles and banks up at each like a bicycle racing track where a corner has to be turned. Each such angle is a veritable bottleneck of obstruction, so it is better to avoid them. The maniple. The maniple, plate 22, has the appearance of a small stole, about 2 feet long, and is worn on the left arm of the celebrant, deacon, and subdeacon at the celebration of the Holy Eucharist. It seems originally to have been a narrow strip of linen used for wiping the face or hands, whence perhaps its name. Gradually it received embellishments. It was bordered by a fringe and decorated with needlework, and finally adopted as a definite ecclesiastical vestment. It now bears 3 crosses, just as a stole does, one at each end and one in the middle, which shows on the upper surface of the arm when it is worn. It has become one of the set of vestments and is therefore made of the same rich materials as the cope or chasuble. In early days it was sometimes worn over the left shoulder, and apparently from the figure of Archbishop Stigand in the Bayeux tapestry it passed through an intermediate stage of being worn over the fingers of the left hand. Thus must soon have been found to be an intolerable arrangement, and it is now slipped over the sleeve of the awl and placed just above the wrist. It is convenient so to sew or button it that it grips the sleeve slightly, or to fasten it in the place with a piece of elastic. I have seen it fixed with a pin, but this method is not to be commended. A button or small loop may be attached to the sleeve of the awl. The maniple may originally have been purely utilitarian, but it has a distinct use for the inner side of things also. The right hand is frequently employed in the ceremonial of the service, and is constantly touching or holding some of the sacred objects connected therewith, so that they send out a strong radiation. Much of this rushes up the right arm, which guards the area of tension sufficiently upon that side, but the left remains open, and much would escape in that direction and be dissipated if it were not for the powerful attraction of the gold crosses on the maniple, which seize it and guide it through the arm of the priest into the general circulation of the force. It will be readily understood that a great effort is involved in the materialization or bringing down of spiritual power from higher planes to lower, and its natural tendency is not used at the lower level is rapidly to evaporate and return to its original form. Wherefore we are anxious to capture and utilize every ounce of it for the purposes for which it has been invoked. I am quite quite aware that to those who have never thought of the scientific side of religion, it seems odd and rather irreverent thus to measure out the grace of God in foot-pounds and talk of saving or wasting it. But we are dealing with definite and observable facts in nature, and I do not see why we should be afraid to face them and learn how to take the best advantage of them. The dalmatic and tunicle. The dalmatic, plate 22, is the vestment worn at the Holy Eucharist, in processions, and at benediction by the deacon, and is so called from the country of Dalmatia, in which it originated. It is a loose garment, slit up at each side with short, wide sleeves. Its orphreys run in straight lines over each other and vertically down to the hem, both before and behind, and are joined by horizontal crossbars near the top and bottom. These orphreys are usually less rich than those of the chasuble, and frequently consist only of two broad lines of gold or silk braid, a few inches apart, just the edges of an orphre as it were. Sometimes gold cords with tassels hang from the sleeves, which are ornamented in the same way as the body of the vestment. There is generally some kind of gold embroidery in the middle of the square or oblong formed by the orphreys both at the back and front, an IHS, a sun with rays, or some other symbol which is useful in collecting force from the people or distributing it to them. As has been explained in an earlier chapter, the deacon and subdeacon act as intermediaries between priest and people, and their vestments are intended to facilitate that work. At the consecration of the host, for example, the deacon, who is kneeling immediately behind the celebrant, raises the point of the chasuble as the celebrant genuflects, and with it either touches the embroidery of his dalmatic, or at least directs the force towards it, so that rushing through him it may spray forth more effectively upon the congregation. The tunicle is the vestment of the subdeacon, and is almost exactly like the dalmatic, except that it is usually less richly ornamented. Also, the dalmatic has generally two bands, where the tunicle has only one. It used to be shorter than the dress of the deacon, but that custom has now disappeared. Both vestments are of silk, of the color of the day, though they are sometimes regarded as part of a set, and in that case would match the chasuble of the celebrant. The humeral veil. This is a strip of silk, usually white, about 8 feet in length and 18 inches wide, which is thrown over the shoulders and hangs in front like a stole. The only occasions on which we use it in the liberal Catholic Church are at benediction of the Blessed Sacrament, and when the host is carried in procession. In the Roman Church it is also used by the subdeacon at High Mass, when he holds the paten with it, and also when the viaticum is carried to the sick. It is often richly decorated, embroidered, edged, and fringed with gold. Indeed, I have seen specimens so stiffened in this way that they could not be used for their legitimate purpose, the holding of the monstrance, but had to be pivoted with pockets of thinner material in which the hands of the bearer could be inserted. This, of course, should not be. We have found that by far the most effective material for the humeral veil, where it can be procured, is that almost transparent Indian silk gauze in which gold is interwoven with silk of some delicate and lovely hue. It does not matter what this color is, blue, rose, purple, yellow, green, so that it be not black, but pure light shades are the best. If Indian gauze be unprocurable, fine white Japanese silk edged with narrow gold braid is a good substitute. The veil is laid upon the shoulders of the officiant just before he takes the monstrance containing the consecrated host at benediction or for the procession, and as his hands being under the veil, he grasps the monstrance through it, and so holds it while giving the benediction or during the procession. The object of the humeral veil is quite distinct from that of any of the other vestments, and so the form of its magnetization or blessing must be different. Other vestments are blessed that they may be good conductors of the spiritual force, but this is especially charged that it may be impermeable by it and may reflect it as far as possible. Just as a reflector placed behind a lamp gathers light which would otherwise be wasted on the walls, and throws it forward into the room, so is the humeral veil intended to reflect the force that would otherwise rush up the arms of the priest when he holds the monstrance, so that it may all be projected directly upon the people. That is the special characteristic of the benediction of the Blessed Sacrament. In all other benedictions, at the end of services, the blessing of the Christ is given through the hand of his priest, a wondrous and most beneficent outpouring, which is made possible by the extraordinary close link which Christ forms with his priest at ordination. But the benediction of the Blessed Sacrament comes directly from the Christ himself, without any human intermediary. The line of living fire which our Lord pours down into the host rays straight out from it over the people, and the difference in its quality is at once observable by the sensitive. The object of the procession of the host is to bring this direct influence of the Christ to bear upon the congregation at close quarters. For that purpose the humeral veil is made into a reflector, so that the whole of the power may be thrown forward with immense force. The bishop who blesses or magnetizes the veil wills strongly that its constitution shall be so changed etherically, astrally, and mentally, that it may act in this particular way, and the change which he thus impresses upon it will remain until it is worn out, unless it is removed by a stronger will. It is much like dyeing a cloth. If the dye is good, it will remain. In his dedication of the veil to its particular work, the bishop may be said to dye its subtler counterparts the necessary color. A sort of smaller and less elaborate humeral veil called the vimpa is worn and used in a similar manner by the acolyte or chaplain who bears a bishop's crozier before him. The rochette. The rochette, plate 24, may be described as the episcopal form of the surplice. It differs from the latter in being shorter, reaching only to the knee, and deeply edged with lace, also in having comparatively tight sleeves with flame-colored cuffs. Likewise, covered with lace, it is always made of the finest linen. Broadly speaking, the rochette does for the bishop what the surplice does for the priest, but there is a certain difference. The bishop is always a radiant center of force, a kind of high-power battery. He is the chosen channel of the Holy Spirit, whose life is continually poured out through him, and he wears flame-colored cuffs not only as a symbol of that force, but as a convenient vehicle for it. This flame color, sometimes called amaranth red, is not always easy to obtain, but it is far more effective than scarlet on the one side or cerise on the other. In the Roman Church, the rochette is also worn by canons and other dignitaries. The mozzetta and mantelletta. These vestments, plate 24, are in effect minor copes, worn over the rochette by prelates in choir, or on occasions when the cope would be inappropriate. The mozzetta is a short cape-like garment covering the shoulders, but reaching only to the elbow. It is fashioned in front by a row of small red buttons, and has a sort of rudimentary hood. It is worn by a bishop in his own diocese, but not outside it, nor in presence of a higher dignitary. It is of the same rose-purple hue as his cassock, and is often made of the same material. It may be of velvet or silk, and should at least be lined with silk. The bishop does not wear it when acting as officiant, so the only forces with which it is intended to deal are those of our second type, those called forth by induction. In the case of a bishop, these are very strong and copious. They boil under the mozzetta, pour out under its edges, and curve up round the bishop, who stands in the midst like the pistil of a flower, the flickering flames of splendid color forming a calyx around him. The force, therefore, flows out all round him, and rays partially upon clergy, choir, and people. The mantelletta, though the inferior garment worn by minor prelates and by a bishop outside his own diocese, or in presence of a higher dignitary, is much the handsomer of the two vestments. It reaches to the knees, practically covering the rochette, except in front where it lies open, its lapels being folded back and fastened in that position. It is of the same rose-purple color as the mozzetta, but it is the custom to line it with amaranth red silk, so the lapels have a very brilliant effect. It is fastened by a single button or hook at the neck, and has slits at the side through which project the sleeves of the rochette. In this case, the forces produced under it by induction ray out through the open sufficient space in front and also through the armholes to the flame-colored cups of the rochette. The mitre. This episcopal headdress, Plate 25, has sufficient resemblance to that of the Jewish high priest to make it a distinct temptation to endeavor to derive one from the other, but unfortunately history does not support this fascinating suggestion. There seems no direct evidence of the appearance of the mitre before about the year 1000 AD, though I think we have seen it somewhat earlier than that in clairvoyant investigations. Some sort of headdress was worn by bishops from the earliest ages, but it is only about the 10th century that it begins to assume the familiar form. Even when it was simply made and not more than 6 inches in height, but about the 14th century it increased to a foot or more and became more superbly enriched. By the 17th century, its size had been still further augmented to 18 inches or even more, and its form had somewhat changed so that it assumed a barrel-like appearance. The Roman Church still affects huge mitres shaped like a pair of parentheses, but in the liberal Catholic Church we have found it most suitable to adopt a pattern of medium size, so arranged that when closed the upper part makes a plain triangle, and when worn the whole mitre is cylindrical in outline. There is, however, no objection to the barrel form where it is preferred. The Roman Church at the present day uses 3 kinds of mitre. I quote again from Mr. McAllister, page 119. Unlike other vestments, which are classified according to the particular liturgical color which predominates in their embroidery, mitres are so its use is optional. In some ritualistic churches, scarlet zacchettos are assigned to the acolytes, but this is incorrect. The biretta, this plate 20, is worn both by bishops and priests, agreeing in each case with the color of the cassock. It is a square folding cap with 3 curved prominences projecting from the crown and a tassel in the center. In France and Spain, birettas with 4 prominences are frequently used, apparently at the fancy of the wearer, though I believe that they ought strictly to be observed from the use of doctors of theology while teaching. The bishop wears his biretta along with the mozzetta or mantelletta, never with the cope or chasuble, but the priest wears his with any vestments, though only at certain parts of the service, such as processions, the epistle, or the sermon. The biretta is always removed before a genuflection is made, though the mitre is not. There is little doubt that the biretta was originally a variant of the square college cap, but it is not without its use in the inner side of the service. Its use is of the same character as that of a cork in a bottle to prevent evaporation and consequent waste. Such force as may be aroused within the priest should accumulate within him and be discharged for the benefit of his people, and not allowed to escape fruitlessly into higher planes, as is its natural tendency. In the same way, steam permitted to escape into the air rises rapidly and dissipates itself. If we wanted to do work down here in the physical world, we must confine and direct it. The 3 prominences on the biretta have the usual 3-fold significance, while the 4 on the cap of the Doctor of Divinity are supposed to be symbolical of the 4 letters of the Tetragrammaton, or sacred name, of which he should have a fuller knowledge than other men. Additional vestments. Both the Roman and the Greek churches use certain additional vestments which we have not so far adopted, as we have been unable to discover that they have any special value either from the symbolical or the esoteric point of view. Such, for example, are the archiepiscopal pallium and the capa magna. It is the Roman custom that bishops should, when officiating at any solemn function, wear stockings and shoes of the color of the season, often embroidered and richly ornamented. There can be no objection to this, but on the other hand it is difficult to see any particular advantage in it. It is usual for a bishop, when not directly officiating, to wear white silk gloves with a gold cross embroidered or sewn on the back of each hand. It would seem that in the Middle Ages these gloves were of the color of the season, and were often adorned with the large jewels in place of the cross. We retain them in the more modern form, plate 25. The pectoral cross. We come now to certain instruments used by the bishop which cannot exactly be termed vestments, but are of great importance in his work: the pectoral cross, the episcopal ring, and the crozier. The first of these is a solidly made cross of gold, or silver gilt, some 3 or 4 inches in length, often heavily jeweled, which is worn on the breast by bishops and abbots, plates 20, 24, and 25. In the Roman Church it usually contains a relic of some sort, when possible a fragment of the alleged wood of the true cross. In the liberal Catholic Church we have found it advantageous to adopt with regard to this cross the same plan as with the altar stone, and to set in it jewels of the 7 rays, though in a slightly different order. A larger central stone is here desirable, and it is most convenient that it should be that of the ray which is now coming into dominating influence in the world, the 7th. We therefore place a fairly large amethyst in that position, and arrange the other gems around it just as before, except that the diamond is immediately above it and the sapphire immediately below. Other smaller amethysts may be at the extremities of the cross. When the new root race becomes prominent, it is probable that it will be well to use the diamond as the central stone, but the present arrangement is the best for the next 1,000 years or so. The pectoral cross is a permanent receiving and discharging station. When it was consecrated, each of the gems was made a special vehicle for the head of its particular ray, so that it becomes a kind of telephone receiver connected with him, an outpost of his consciousness. The force peculiar to him is always raying out through it, just as the magnetism of any ordinary person is always to be felt when one comes near him. But the ordinary person, if his attention is attracted to any specific case, or if his sympathy is aroused, can at once bring that radiating magnetism to a focus and concentrate it upon the object which appeals to him. In the same way, the force of a ray streams always through its consecrated stone. But when any person who belongs to that ray comes near that stone, it is at once aroused into more vigorous action, and the person, if at all receptive, may receive an extraordinary outpouring of strength and help. The type of critic who is always anxious to do without everything will of course say that one could surely attract the attention of the head of a ray by praying to him without any physical plane link. It may be so, just as one can to some extent communicate across a valley with a friend on the opposite hill by shouting to him, but the result can be attained more certainly and comfortably and with far less strain by using a telephone. Besides, some friends are too far away to be reached by shouting, and a properly made psychic telephone can never be put out of order, as our earthly telephones so often are. So much for the pectoral cross, but why does only a bishop wear it, and what part does he play in its action? The link of the bishop with his Lord and Master has been explained in the chapter on holy orders. It makes him, as I have said before, a highly charged battery, so we may carry on the telephonic analogy and say that the bishop supplies the current which makes the telephone work. Like the altar stone, the pectoral cross acts as a prism for the forces which are always flowing through the bishop. The bishop is a center of second-ray force, but in that ray, as in all the others, there are 7 sub-rays. There is the second ray as influenced by the first, by the third, by the fourth, and so on, as well as the pure second ray. So when the second ray force of the Christ pours out from the heart center of his bishop into the cross which hangs in front of it, it is instantly split up by the stones into its component parts and shed upon those around in the most easily assimilable form. Prominence is given to the 7th ray because that is just now coming into operation. Each of these rays influences the world in turn. The 6th, or devotional ray, was dominant during the Middle Ages. As its power waned, we had a period of disbelief, irreligion, and profound ignorance of the inner side of life. The 7th ray involves the study and use of the inner forces of nature and intelligent cooperation with the powers which wield them. That is the influence which is now dawning upon the world, and therefore we give it the central position in the bishop's pectoral cross and offer it additional channels of manifestation. The Roman Church quite rightly instructs her bishops that the pectoral cross should be worn outside the mozzetta, but inside the mantelletta. She also directs that it shall remain inside the chasuble at the celebration. But in this point we have ventured to diverge from her custom, because we find that under the new conditions set up by the use of the 7 jewels in the altar stone, the interaction between them and those in the cross is of great value. Consequently, we instruct our bishops that it is wiser to let the pectoral cross hang outside the chasuble. The episcopal ring. A bishop seems to have worn a special ring as one of the insignia of his office from very early periods, though the first definite notice of it that remains to us is of the year 610 A.D. It was considered to symbolize the sealing up of secrets and also the conjugal fidelity demanded by the marriage of the bishop to his diocese. It was also a gold ring with one large stone, said to have been indifferently a ruby, an emerald, or a sapphire, generally unengraved. Now it is usually an amethyst of oval shape, as large as can be had, and the coat of arms of the bishop is engraved upon it, so that it can actually be used as a seal if necessary. The bishop, however, has often a larger brass seal for official use. The ring must be made rather loose, for when the bishop wears his glove during the services, he must slip on his ring outside it. Sometimes, therefore, it has been found necessary to wear a smaller ring as a keeper. The ring, plates 20, 24, and 25, plays an important part in the bishop's work. At his consecration, it is definitely linked with our Lord himself, not through the higher principles of the bishop, but directly in a manner not unlike the consecration of the host. It is therefore a line of communication with him outside of the bishop's personality altogether, and uncolored by any idiosyncrasies of his. It is always radiating the special and personal magnetism of the Christ. In fact, the nearest that I can come to a description of its peculiar potency is to say that it has the same effect as a ring that had been worn by Christ himself. It is thus a center of tremendous power, and when the bishop gives his solemn blessing, the floodgates of that power are opened to the utmost. The blessing of a bishop is marvelous in its complexity and adaptability, and it is worthwhile going a long way to obtain it. And the action of his ring is one of its most important factors. The explanation of the other factors will be found in the chapter on holy orders. The crozier. This is the pastoral staff of a bishop, a staff with its head curled round something in the manner of a shepherd's crook, from which some have supposed it to be derived, plate 25. This ancestry is by no means certain. Another theory is that it is the descendant of the litus, or crook, which was one of the emblems carried by the Roman augur in pre-Christian days. Certainly the pastoral staff, as depicted in some of the earliest Christian monuments, is practically identical with this augur's wand, for the primitive crozier seems to have been much shorter in the stem than its modern equivalent. Indeed, the strengthening of that staff probably occurred only when it began to be made of materials so heavy that it was advisable to support its weight upon the ground. It is unquestionably one of the earliest external symbols which the Church prescribed for her officers, for croziers have been found illustrated in the catacombs, and a staff alleged to be that of St. Peter is preserved in the Cathedral of Trier, or Treves. Both the material of the staff and its shape have varied considerably. In the beginning, it was a wooden rod, generally of cedar, cypress, or ebony, often gilt or overlaid with silver plates. Soon the head began to be made of precious metal or carved ivory, and later the whole staff was of ivory or enameled metal. The Irish croziers were often bronze, decorated with wonderful interlacing knots and bands. In modern days, the whole staff is usually of brass or silver heavily gilt, and sometimes richly jeweled, though this is unnecessary. Many forms were tried in the early centuries, and we meet with Y and T-shaped heads, as well as knobs, volutes, volutes, and crooks. The head of the bronze Irish crozier is almost always an inverted U. By the 11th century, the crook form was universally adopted, except in the Greek church, which still retains the T shape, the crosspiece being generally made of two serpents, apparently threatening each other. Even in the Western church, there are still three variants of the crook, as will be seen from our illustration, diagram 18. The center of the volute often represents some sacred incident, some saint or angel, or some symbolical or heraldic device: a lamb, a bunch of grapes, a host, and chalice. The knob is frequently very elaborate, often serving the purposes of a reliquary. In the liberal Catholic Church, we use any of these three forms, with a preference for that on the right of our diagram, as being better balanced and having the center of the volute more directly above the knob, which obviates an awkward angle in the flow of the force. In the case of the altar stone, we substitute the set of 7 magnetized jewels for the relic inside the knob, arranging them just as for the altar. The crozier has been considered in all ages the symbol of authority and jurisdiction. It must not be confused with the special cross which marks the dignity of the archbishop. The latter has its own crozier, like any other bishop, and uses it at the same points of the service, but in addition to that, a kind of processional cross which he does not use is carried before him as he enters, leaves, or moves about the church. Regarded from the point of view of its inner effect, the crozier is an instrument of the greatest value. The insertion of the jewels makes it equivalent to a portable altar stone, and in addition to that, it is provided with a unique arrangement for the application of spiritual force to the different principles or divisions of man. The curves of the volute are used for this purpose, and they divide themselves automatically into 3 parts, as shown in our drawing, diagram 18. It would be advantageous to mark off these divisions by physical partitions or discs of such substance as chalcedony, chrysoprase, jade, or jasper, but this means to present serious difficulties to the manufacturer. Fortunately, it is easy for a magnetizer to make them etherically. The knob in which the gems are set is the focus and fount of activity, an intense center of living fire from which the force shoots up into the volute. All forms of the energy are present there, but the etheric is the outermost and the most prominent, so prominent that it would not be surprising if physical cures could be effected by its touch. The first partition or filter is arranged to arrest etheric matter, so that only the astral, mental, and still higher manifestations of the force can pass through it. The curve of the volute is, to some extent, slackens the speed of the uprush, and makes it easier for us to direct it. In this portion, between the first and second partitions, the astral expression of the force is its outermost and most conspicuous manifestation, and so it is from this curve of the staff that the influence proceeds, which is principally active in stimulating devotion, and both arousing and controlling the emotions of the people. The second partition throws back all astral matter, so that beyond that is the mental aspect of the energy, which is most in evidence, and its tendency is to encourage high and clear thinking, and generally to vivify mental processes. The third partition strains away even the lower mental matter, so that only the higher mental matter of which the causal body is built can pass through into the central ornament, which terminates the volute, which is consequently capable of exercising a most powerful influence upon the ego or soul of the man who is sufficiently developed to be able to lay himself open to it. That does not in the least mean that special cleverness is required, but only that a man should be in a humble, grateful, and receptive frame of mind. For truly, as he has said, the Christ stands and knocks at the door of man's heart and waits to be admitted, but he never forces his way in. For still higher levels, no special part of the crozier is reserved. They cannot be confined or localized quite in the same way as those others. The whole staff is permeated with the influence of the institutional world, for that can penetrate all principles at any level, if people will only let it. The projections or spikes which are generally to be seen on the curves of the volute allow these different grades of force to flow out readily from their respective sections of the crozier upon the people. Croziers are often richly ornamented and heavily jeweled. When the latter is to be done, it is appropriate to have have a sapphire, or several of them, upon the knob containing the gems, jasper or topaz, upon the first or etheric division, rubies upon the second or astral, emeralds or jade upon the third, which is mental, and a diamond or an amethyst in the center to mark the fourth. The practical action of the crozier during the various services of the church is exceedingly powerful, and embraces quite a bewildering complication of details. It works simultaneously in several directions. It acts upon the bishop, it receives from him, and it rays out power upon the congregation. At some points of the service, the bishop has to hold it so that its force may mingle with his. At others, it is sufficient that it be held beside him or carried in front of him. When he administers confirmation, for example, it is held beside him while he accepts the candidate in Christ's name, but he takes it in his hand when he utters the words in power, "Receive the Holy Ghost." He holds it when giving absolution and benediction, and it is wonderful to see how its ever-present glow swells into a blinding light as the words are uttered, the central point showing three star-like points, white, blue, and rose. To see these points needs a high development of clairvoyance, for they are an expression of the triple spirit of the Christ, and can be perceived only through the reflection of the same spirit in us. We have examined many croziers and the services in many churches, and the same links are made in every case, but unfortunately they are often allowed to remain sterile. Most bishops and priests know nothing about them. Naturally enough, it is not necessary that they should know, though of course it is far better if they do. Intense devotion and earnest aspiration will set all this machinery in motion, without actual perception of what is being done. The great fact of the Holy Eucharist remains wherever there is the apostolic succession, but the outpouring of its power is often sadly limited, and what we may call the side avenues are altogether choked and disused. The very information here given is sufficient to enable many a bishop or priest to redouble the strength and effect of his services, but precisely those who are most in need of it would be the last to believe it or profit by it. Nothing is sadder to one who has developed the inner sight than to encounter the blank, self-satisfied ignorance and skepticism of those who do not yet possess it. They are so sure that there can be nothing beyond what they can see, no light beyond that of their tiny lamps, and so they live like a caterpillar upon his leaf, surrounded by all the splendors of earth and sea and sky, but utterly unheeding. Evolution steadily progresses, and even they will see one day, for nearer and nearer draws the time that shall surely be, when the earth shall be filled with the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. Chapter 9. Vespers and Solemn Benediction. Vespers. This is the most ancient of the offices of the Church, as distinct from the Holy Eucharist, which is not numbered among the offices. We find Vespers mentioned by Pliny in his famous letter at the beginning of the 2nd century, though we do not know exactly what form of service was then used. It is described in the Peregrinatio, a document probably of the 4th century, while in 530, in the Rule of Saint Benedict, it appears practically in the present Roman form, containing the Psalms, the little chapter, the versicles, and the canticle Magnificat. Lauds and Vespers are the Church's two daily services of praise, the two which have usually been sung in public, most of the other hours of prayer being recited privately by priests and monks. Of these two, Vespers has always been the more important, first because Lauds was generally sung at sunrise or earlier. Indeed, it seems often to have followed directly upon Matins, which began at 2 o'clock in the morning, so that it was extremely inconvenient for the laity to attend it. Secondly, because the Holy Eucharist was naturally from the first the great morning service, and soon entirely overshadowed Lauds. The latter scarcely ever appears now among the public records of services of the Roman Church, and we have not printed it in our liturgy. Vespers was originally the evening office, but when Saint Benedict introduced Compline as the concluding act of the day, Vespers began to be sung any time from 4 o'clock to 6, and came to be regarded as the sunset service, as Lauds was that of sunrise. Sometime in the 6th century, the office hymn was introduced, a set of such hymns indeed, for there was one for each day of the week, referring to the supposed stages of creation. On Sunday, it refers to the creation of light, on Monday to the separation of the earth and the waters, on Tuesday to the creation of plants, on Wednesday to that of the sun and moon, on Thursday to that of the fishes, and on Friday to that of the beasts. Saturday is an exception because the Vespers sung that day are really the first Vespers of Sunday, so the hymn is in the praise of the Blessed Trinity. It is this last which we have adopted in our service, for it has seemed best to us to have an unvarying form in which only the collect for the day changes. The scheme of Vespers is that of a steady outflow of praise, working gradually up to the culmination of love, devotion, and gratitude, which evokes so bounteous a response that the whole neighborhood is flooded with its radiation. In our liturgy, we have followed the structure of the old service, but the component matter is different. We use 5 psalms, but instead of taking them just as they stand, we have avoided all abusive, cringing, or meaningless verses, and have built them up out of the most beautiful and suitable that we can find in the Scripture. Praise being the keynote of the whole service, we have devoted 3 of the Psalms to it entirely. Of the others, one extols the godly life, and the other is a panegyric or wisdom. They are all especially intended to call forth the enthusiasm of the people, and to exalt their thought and feeling to the highest that is possible for them. In order fully to attain the result, it is necessary that all should join in the psalms, that they should attend carefully to the words which they are singing, and should try to feel them as well as to understand them. The whole church should by this time be filled with living force, which manifests in huge clouds of coruscating light. All through the singing of the psalms, these clouds are accumulating, banking up in the sanctuary, swirling about before the altar, boiling upwards, and falling back again, but on the whole growing steadily denser, with ripples shooting across as the choir and congregation sing antiphonally. Mostly these clouds are of various shades of blue, but sometimes golden stars of aspiration fly through them, or tapering gleams of gold flicker like flames. Again, in addition to the figures made by the devotion of the people, there are the musical forms made by the organ and by the voices of the choir. Upon all that comes the reading of the little chapter, surrounded by pomp and ceremony, which is intended not only to draw special attention to its words, but also to aid into the distribution of its dominant thought of love, which pours out in a splendid crimson stream. Assistant priests gather round the officiant, an acolyte with a lighted candle stands on each side of him, and incense is used much as at the reading of the gospel. The object of this chapter is to make practically available all this potential force which has been generated, to supply for it an immense driving power by evoking the sense of brotherhood and strong mutual affection. In primitive times, when these words of the apostle were read in the church, it was the custom for the members of the congregation to turn to one another and embrace. And though in our more artificial modern society such demonstrations would be inadmissible, we ought assuredly to send forth with all our hearts the feelings which they were meant to express. The little chapter supplies us with motive force, as it were. It gives us the powder for our gun, while the office hymn which immediately follows tells us in what direction to point it. For it turns our thought to the ever-blessed Trinity, from whom all has come, to whom all will return. The people should throw their strength into this hymn, especially into its well-known doxology, which never fails to attract the attention of the angelic hosts. This causes our dense mass of cloud to boil vigorously, and it begins to rise into a conical shape, not unlike a bell tent. The preparation being thus completed, we now take the great effort towards which all the earlier part of the service service has been leading up. In the Roman ritual, this place is filled by the canticle called the Magnificat, but that song of Our Lady, beautiful as much as it is far less effective for our present purpose of a mighty outburst of praise than the Te Deum Laudamus, which is the great morning act of homage, being usually sung at end of matins and just before lauds. As we at present recite neither of these morning offices, we have borrowed the Te Deum for use at Vespers, and have found it eminently suitable for that position. In its original form, it is among the most ancient of the Church's hymns. There is a tradition that it was spontaneously composed and sung in alternate verses by St. Ambrose and St. Augustine on the night of the latter's baptism in the year 387, but this story is rejected by scholars. Its authorship is uncertain, and it is probable that it grew up gradually and passed through various modifications. The first 10 verses are ascribed to Pope Anicetus, who died AD 168, but it is supposed to have been put together in the form in which it now appears in Roman books and in the Anglican prayer book by Nicetas, Bishop of Remesiana in Romania, about the year 400. It has also been attributed to Athanasius, to Hilary of Poitiers, to Hilary of Arles, to Nicetius of Treves, to Abondius. Koch asserts it to be an evening hymn of primitive antiquity, originally written in Greek, translated into Latin by St. Ambrose for the use of his church at Milan, and subsequently introduced into the North African churches by St. Augustine. He further states that it is to be found in its Greek form in one of the earlier manuscripts of the 6th century. St. Benedict, in his rule, directs that it shall be sung in the nocturnal office for Sundays, so we are making no serious innovation in using it at Vespers. It has undoubtedly been in daily use in English cathedrals, abbeys, and churches since the Norman conquest, except when the Benedicite was substituted for it, as it often is in Advent and Lent. Its title is, as usual, the Latin form of the opening words. Unfortunately, after its 15th verse, the original Te Deum somewhat changes its character and becomes first a kind of historical retrospect or confession of faith, and ends by degenerating into the ordinary abject appeals for mercy, though even in that part of the spirit of joy and praise irresistibly breaks out in 2 or 3 verses. That descent into the minor key being distinctly insuitable for the inner purpose which the great hymn has to subserve, we have ventured to substitute more joyous verse for these which are less in keeping with its general tone. During the singing of the Te Deum, it is an old custom to kindle additional lights upon the altar, as many as possible, to assist in the gathering and radiation of the power. The altar is solemnly censed, as are the clergy, choir, and people. The assistant priests group themselves around and behind the officiant, who stands on the footplace before the middle of the altar, and behind them in turn stand 2 thurifers, swinging their censers alternately at the full length of the chain. Incense is always efficient in attracting the attention of any angels who may happen to be in the neighborhood, though indeed that is done by the doxology to the hymn, and even by the invocation of the Holy Trinity at the beginning of the service. The angels are not specially called at Vespers, as they are at the Holy Eucharist, but I have never seen a properly rendered service at which they failed to put in an appearance. They seize upon the heavily charged clouds of light which have been generated during the earlier part of the service, and speedily form them into a whirling vortex round the officiant and his assistants, a vortex from which shoots up a jet of force at high pressure, which makes a great cylinder reaching up to and through the roof of the church, Plate 26. Through it pours up in a vast fountain of blue and rose the devotional love of the people, reinforced by that of the holy angels, and the inevitable response descends in a torrent of white and gold enormously greater than the uprush, though in strict proportion to it. This forms another far larger cylinder enclosing the first, and the force which comes down through it slides as it were over the surface of the stream of devotion from the people, and radiates over a wide area of the surrounding country, although a considerable sprinkling of it penetrates to the congregation too. This downpouring draws into itself and greatly intensifies all good thoughts and feelings that happen to be floating about. It continues until the Te Deum is finished, and then gradually dies away. This force is in several ways different from that which is given to us at the Holy Eucharist. That is the especial gift of the Christ himself, whereas this comes directly from the Blessed Trinity as a whole. That can be and is aimed at particular people, devoted to definite objects. This floods the neighborhood like a sea. It is less under the control of the priest, and the angels make no effort to apportion it, but only to facilitate its outpouring. The angels whom it attracts are not the trained specialists who do the work of the Eucharist, nor are the representatives of the 9 orders invoked. It is frequently the custom that benediction of the Most Holy Sacrament shall allow immediately after Vespers. If it does, it is usually found convenient to omit the 3 collects from the prayer book of the Church of England, which precede the final versicles and blessing. If Compline be said in place of benediction, the collects are recited in that office and not here. Benediction of the Most Holy Sacrament. This is one of the most beautiful of all the services of the Church, and yet one of the simplest. It has been called the Mass of the Evening, because the same wonderful forces are given out in it as in the Holy Eucharist. The latter can be celebrated only in the morning, but in the evening benediction to some extent takes its place. The essential features of the service are that the host is removed from the tabernacle, placed in the monstrance, and exhibited for the veneration of the people, that it is then carried round the church in procession, and finally that a solemn benediction is given with it. Certain traditional hymns have been associated with it ever since its introduction in the 13th century, and it is usual in the Roman Church to sing the beautiful litany to Our Lady, commonly called the Litany to Loreto, the Litany of Loreto, before the exposed host. For that we substitute, as more appropriate to the occasion, a litany addressed to our Lord himself, but except for that change we sing the hymns that have always been sung, though in English instead of Latin. I fully admit that the Latin is more sonorous, but we attach great importance to making everything in our services readily comprehensible, so that everyone present can join intelligently in them. It is probable that the inception of this service of benediction was closely connected with the institution of the Feast of Corpus Christi in the year 1246, but it is soon after that we first hear of it. Some have thought it strange that a service so wonderful in its effect, so full of comfort for his people, should not have been ordered by our Lord from the beginning. It is not for us to criticize the plan which he has adopted when dealing with his evolution. Progresses, new possibilities open up, so that what was useful in the 13th century may have been inappropriate in the first. To me personally, it seems probable that our dear Lord himself tries experiments, tries new methods of pouring out blessing, and therefore this especial form of service may have occurred to him not while he was upon earth, but later, though I fear that such an idea will be unacceptable to many. Another great religion speaks of him as Avalokiteshvara, the Lord who looks down from on high, and we know that he looks down on us through many avenues, and that the forces poured upon us along these different lines interact, and in interacting strengthen one another. The celebrant in benediction wears a surplice, white stole and cope, though if he has just been officiating at Vespers in a cope of the color of the day, and does not leave the altar between the services, it is permissible for him to retain the cope which he is wearing. But if he has, as he should have when possible, a deacon and subdeacon in attendance in dalmatic and tunicle, he should wear the amice, alb, and girdle instead of a surplice. He must have a server to bring the humeral veil and ring the bell, at least 2 acolytes with candles and a thurifer, though 2 censors are better than 1 for the dignified rendering of the service, at least 12 candles must be burning on the altar, more if possible. The service begins, like all others in our church, with the invocation, and immediately thereafter all kneel while a priest removes the host from the tabernacle, places it in the monstrance, and stands the monstrance on a corporal on the altar. The celebrant, kneeling, offers incense before the most holy sacrament, using 3 triple swings, as in the beginning of the first censing at the celebration of the Holy Eucharist. He puts the incense in the censer, but does not bless it, for no human blessing is given while the host is exposed. Meanwhile, the congregation sings the 2 verses beginning O Salutaris Hostia, written by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. O saving victim, opening wide the gate of heaven to man below. Our foes press in from every side, thine aid supply, thy strength bestow. All praise and thanks to thee ascend, for evermore, blessed one in 3. O grant us life that shall not end, in our true native land with thee. This is, of course, a direct personal appeal to our Lord, addressed to him through the channel which he himself, in that extension of his consciousness which we call the angel of the presence, has made for us at the consecration of the host. That host is itself a kind of outpost of his consciousness, and when his attention is attracted by that appeal, it at once glows vividly in response. Understand, the consecrated host always glows as it rests in the tabernacle, and answers by an increase of light to every private act of worship offered through it. But now, in gracious reply to the devotion felt by a whole congregation, expressed through the censing and the singing of that well-known hymn, the Lord turns, as it were, a higher layer of his attention upon us, and that host burns like a veritable sun. Let me once more quote from the description which I wrote when I was first led to observe these wonderful phenomena many years ago in a village in Sicily. The elevation of the host immediately after its consecration was not the only occasion upon which a display of force took place. When the benediction was given with the Blessed Sacrament, exactly the same thing happened. On several occasions I followed the procession of the host through the streets, and every time that a halt was made at some half-ruined church, and the benediction was given from its steps, precisely the same double phenomenon was produced. I observed that the reserved host upon the altar of the church was all day long steadily pouring forth the former of the 2 influences, force A, though not so strongly as at the moment of elevation or benediction.